What you're about to hear is a story about silence. The kind of silence that's so total, so heavy, it has a sound of its own. It's a low hum, a pressure in your ears, the sound of being utterly and completely forgotten. For me, that silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My name is Leonard. I'm 72 years old, and for a while there I thought my life was over. I was wrong. It was just waiting for a new score. If you've ever been made to feel small, to feel like your only purpose was to serve someone else's needs, then I think you'll understand my story. Stick around, and I'll tell you how I traded the deafening silence of my son's world for the glorious, chaotic noise of my own. And if my story resonates with you, I hope you'll let me know by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I've learned that finding a community, even one right here online, is a powerful thing. Now let me tell you what happened. The whole thing began, as so many endings do, with a conversation that felt more like a verdict. My son Daniel and his wife Karen sat on the floral sofa in my living room, the same sofa my Helen and I had picked out 30 years ago. They had expressions of practiced concern on their faces, the kind you see on television doctors giving bad news. Daniel cleared his throat. He had my wife's eyes, but none of her warmth. "Dad," he began, leaning forward and placing his hands on his knees. "We've been talking, and we're worried about you here. This house, it's just too much for one person." I looked around the room. The familiar scuff on the hardwood floor, where our old dog Buster used to sleep. The faint, pleasant scent of sawdust that always drifted in from my workshop in the garage. The bookshelf Helen had filled with her poetry collections. Too much? It was everything. It was the entire archive of my life. "I'm managing just fine, Daniel," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the sudden tension. Karen jumped in, her voice a little too bright, a little too saccharine. "Oh, Leonard, we know you are. You're so independent. It's just the maintenance, the stairs. We found the most wonderful place for you, a senior apartment. It's secure, all on one level, no yard work. You won't have to worry about a thing." They said it was about my safety, about my peace of mind, but I knew what it was really about. It was about the house. My house, in a neighborhood that had become increasingly fashionable, was a significant asset. Paid off decades ago, it represented a sum of money that made my son's eyes gleam in a way they never did when he looked at me. They saw an asset to be liquidated, not a home to be cherished. They saw a problem to be managed, not a father to be cared for. I could have fought them. I should have fought them, but I was tired. It had only been a year since Helen passed, and the fight had gone out of me. And there was the promise. In her last days, her hand frail in mine, she'd whispered, "Look after Daniel, Lenny. He's ambitious. He gets ahead of himself. Just keep the peace. Don't make waves." So I didn't make waves. I let the tide of their ambition pull me under. I packed 40 years of life into a handful of boxes. My workshop tools, my collection of vintage sheet music, my woodworking projects. All of it was sold off in an estate sale they organized with brutal efficiency. They called it decluttering. I called it erasure. They moved me into the apartment. It was clean, beige, and utterly soulless. It smelled like fresh paint and loneliness. The one window looked out onto a brick wall. On the last day of the move, after the last box was set down, Daniel handed me a new phone. It was a simple flip phone, the kind with giant buttons. "We got you this, Dad," he said, beaming as if he'd just handed me the keys to a kingdom. "It's much simpler than your old one. All the important numbers are programmed in. Ours 911, you know." I took it. It felt like a child's toy in my hand. "What's the number?" I asked. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. We'll call you to check in. We have the number. You just have to press the green button to answer. He and Karen gave me quick, sterile hugs and left. The door clicked shut, and the silence began its reign. A day passed, then two. By the end of the first week, I started to worry. Maybe they were busy. Daniel's work was very important, he always told me. I tried to call him from the new phone, but I realized I didn't know how. I couldn't find a contacts list, and I certainly didn't know his number by heart anymore. It had been saved in my old smartphone, which they had recycled. I waited. The silence in that apartment was a physical presence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house I'd known with Helen. This was an active, aggressive silence. It was the sound of a line going dead. It was the sound of being unplugged from the world. After 2 weeks, a cold dread began to seep into my bones. It was a terrifying thought, one I tried to push away, but it kept returning. They hadn't forgotten to give me the number. They had omitted it. They hadn't lost it. They had discarded it. They had put me in this box, given me a phone that could only receive their calls, and then they had simply not called. They had my new number, but I didn't have theirs. I was on a one-way line, waiting for a call that never came. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a statement. It said, "You are no longer needed. You are no longer relevant. Your role is to sit here quietly and wait, and if we need you, we will let you know." That realization was the true inciting incident. Not the move, not the sale of my things, but the cold, calculated cruelty of that forgotten phone number. It was a betrayal so profound it hollowed me out. They hadn't just moved me out of my home, they had moved me out of their lives. And in the ringing silence of that beige apartment, I felt myself begin to disappear. On a whim, I joined the local community orchestra just to have a reason to leave the house. I was a music teacher for 40 years, and before I knew it, they'd asked me to be their conductor. I've found more joy in the screech of a beginner's violin than I've had in years. When my son finally called out of the blue to ask for money, I told him I couldn't help. I'd just spent my savings on a new set of timpani drums for my family. The first few weeks in that apartment were a slow-motion collapse. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of a single bedroom, a small living area, and a kitchenette where the refrigerator hummed a mournful, monotonous tune. It was the only sound for days on end. I would sit in the armchair they'd allowed me to keep, Helen's favorite, its chintz fabric faded and worn, and I would just listen to the silence. It was a living thing, a predator. It ate my thoughts, my memories, my will to move. Mornings were the worst. For 40 years, I'd woken up at 6 a.m. to the smell of coffee brewing, to the sounds of a house coming to life. Helen would be rustling in the kitchen, the radio playing softly. Later, after she was gone, it was the habit itself that kept me going. The ritual of making coffee, reading the paper, planning my day in the workshop. Here in the beige box, the sun would filter through the single window, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the stale air, and my first thought would be, what for? What is the point of getting out of this chair? I lost weight. The pre-packaged meals Daniel had arranged to be delivered once a week sat uneaten in the freezer. They were called Golden Years dinners, a name so insultingly cheerful it made my stomach turn. I'd open the freezer door, see the stacks of plastic trays with their pictures of smiling seniors, and just shut it again, my appetite vanishing completely. I subsisted on toast and tea. Sometimes I'd forget to eat altogether until a gnawing emptiness in my gut reminded me. My days bled into one another, a featureless gray landscape of waiting. I'd read the same page of a book over and over, my mind unable to hold the words. I'd stare at the brick wall outside my window, tracing the patterns of the mortar with my eyes until they burned. The past was a far more vivid country, and I retreated there constantly. I remembered Daniel as a boy, so full of life and promise. I taught him his first chords on the guitar. His small fingers struggled to hold down the strings, but his face was a mask of pure concentration and joy. I remembered him looking up at me, his eyes wide with awe, and saying, "Dad, when I grow up I want to be just like you." Where did that boy go? When did his admiration curdle into this cold, dismissive sense of duty that felt more like contempt? I thought of Helen, and the ache was a physical thing, a constant pressure behind my ribs. I recalled a conversation we'd had years ago, long before she got sick. Daniel had just graduated from business school, and he was already talking about leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers. He used a language I didn't understand, full of aggressive, predatory terms. Helen had been quiet for a long time, watching him from the kitchen doorway as he paced our living room, talking on his phone. Later that night, in bed, she'd turned to me. "He sees the world as a series of transactions, Lenny," she'd said, her voice laced with a sadness I couldn't quite place at the time. "Be careful. Make sure he remembers that a family isn't a business. A father isn't a resource." I had dismissed her concerns. "He's just ambitious, honey. He's got a good head on his shoulders." "It's not his head I worry about," she had murmured. "It's his heart." Now sitting in that silent apartment, her words echoed back to me with the force of prophecy. She had seen it all. She had understood that to Daniel, I was just a resource. My home was an asset. My savings were a safety net. My love was an expectation. It wasn't a relationship. It was an account from which he could withdraw at will. The pattern of his withdrawals was a long and painful one to trace. There was the down payment on his first house, a place far grander than he could afford. "It's an investment, Dad," he'd explained. "You have to look the part to get ahead." I'd liquidated a portion of my retirement savings, the money Helen and I had earmarked for a trip to Italy. We never went. Then there was the failed tech startup. He'd been so convincing, so full of jargon and projected earnings. He'd lost not only his own money but a significant chunk of mine. He never apologized. He just called it a learning experience and blamed the market. It was always someone else's fault. The most painful was the school tuition for my grandkids, Liam and Sophie. I adored them, but I rarely saw them. Daniel and Karen always had an excuse. The kids were busy with soccer, with piano lessons, with play dates. But when the tuition bills came due for their ridiculously expensive private academy, Daniel's calls became much more frequent. "It's for the kids, Dad," he'd say, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. "How could you say no to your own grandchildren's future?" So I paid. I paid to maintain a connection that was becoming increasingly transactional. I was paying for the privilege of being their grandfather, a role I was barely allowed to perform. The move itself had been the final masterful transaction. I sat down one afternoon and did the math on a napkin. The price they'd gotten for my house, minus the listed price of my new tiny apartment, left a very, very large number. They'd told me the rest was in a managed trust account for my future care. They'd shown me a statement, a slick piece of paper from a company I'd never heard of. But when Daniel explained it, his words were a slippery, confusing mess of management fees, capital gains, and administrative costs. I didn't understand it then, but I understood it now. They had paid themselves handsomely for the service of dismantling my life. I was sitting there staring at that napkin when the flip phone on the end table suddenly rang. My heart leaped into my throat. The sound was so jarring, so alien in the tomb-like quiet, that I nearly dropped it. I fumbled to press the green button. "Hello?" I said, my voice a dry croak. "Leonard, it's Carol from Golden Years Dinners." The voice was professionally cheerful. "We're just calling to confirm your delivery for this week. Our driver noted that last week's meals were still in the freezer. Is everything all right? Are you enjoying the classic beef pot roast?" I looked at the brick wall outside my window. A single stubborn weed was growing out of a crack in the mortar. "Everything," I said slowly, the words tasting like ash, "is just fine." I hung up the phone, and that was the catalyst. It wasn't a call from my son. It was a call from a meal delivery service, a cog in the machine. Daniel had built to manage me. The absurdity, the cold, impersonal nature of it all was like a splash of icy water to the face. I was no longer a person. I was a client, a problem that had been solved. I stood up. My knees ached. My back was stiff. But for the first time in weeks I felt a spark. It wasn't hope. It was anger. A cold, clear, diamond-hard anger. Helen had asked me not to make waves, but she was gone, and I was drowning in the still water of my son's neglect. I put on my coat and my walking shoes. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get out of that box. I walked down the sterile hallway, past the identical beige doors, and out into the crisp autumn air. The world felt sharp and real after the muffled reality of my apartment. I walked for what felt like miles, my anger propelling me forward. I ended up in the old town square, a place I hadn't visited in years, and that's when I saw it. Tacked to a community bulletin board, faded by the sun and peeling at the corners, was a flyer. It was printed in a clumsy font, with a slightly crooked picture of a smiling group of people holding instruments. It read, "The Oak Creek Community Orchestra welcomes all. No audition necessary. Bring your instrument and your love of music. Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Community Hall." I stared at that flyer for a long time. For 40 years my life had been music. I was a high school music teacher. I'd directed the marching band, the jazz ensemble, the school orchestra. I'd spent my days surrounded by the glorious, chaotic, life-affirming noise of people trying to make something beautiful together. The screech of a beginner's violin, the honk of a saxophone learning its notes, the thunderous crash of a cymbal hit a moment too soon. It was the soundtrack of my life, a life my son had silenced. An idea, a tiny fragile thing, began to form in my mind. It wasn't a plan, it was just a whim, a desperate reach for a familiar shore. I had one instrument left, my old clarinet. Daniel had deemed it worthless at the estate sale, so it had been packed in a box of personal effects. I walked home, my steps a little faster, a little more purposeful. I went into my apartment, and for the first time I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like a man with a destination. I opened the closet, dug past the sensible cardigans Karen had bought for me, and found the worn black case. I opened it. The clarinet lay nestled in its velvet lining, its silver keys tarnished, its reeds old and dry. It smelled of cork grease and memory. I didn't know if I could still play. I didn't know if I even wanted to. But I knew that next Tuesday at 7 p.m. I had a reason to leave the house. I was going to the community hall. I was going to break the silence. That Tuesday, walking to the community hall felt like stepping off a cliff. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to retreat to the familiar misery of my apartment. I was a ghost, a relic. What was I doing? I hadn't played my clarinet in earnest for over 5 years, not since Helen first got sick. My fingers felt stiff and clumsy, my lungs weak. The worn case in my hand felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the ghost of the man I used to be. The hall was in the basement of the public library, a cavernous, poorly lit room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. The sound hit me before I was even through the door. It was a cacophony, a glorious, unholy mess of noise. A trumpet was squeaking its way through a warm-up scale. A fleet of violins sawed away at a passage, each at a slightly different tempo, and somewhere in the back, a cymbal crashed with enthusiastic inaccuracy. It was awful, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It was the sound of effort, the sound of life. I slipped into a chair in the back of the woodwind section, hoping to remain invisible. The room was a motley collection of humanity. There were teenagers with braces on their teeth sitting next to retirees with hearing aids. There was a woman in a nurse's uniform who must have come straight from her shift, and a man in a rumpled business suit who looked utterly exhausted. These weren't professionals. These were people who, for one reason or another, needed to make music. I felt a kinship with them instantly. The conductor, a nervous, balding man named Mr. Abernathy, tapped his baton. He tried to lead them through a simplified arrangement of a Mozart piece, but it was a losing battle. The strings were out of tune, the brass section was overzealous, and the rhythm was, to put it mildly, suggestive. They fell apart halfway through. During a break, a large grizzly bear of a man with a magnificent white beard and hands like catcher's mitts lumbered over to me. He pointed a thick finger at my clarinet case. "You gonna play that thing or just use it as a doorstop?" he growled. I fumbled to open the case. "I was just getting my bearings," I mumbled. He squinted at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Wait a minute, I know you. You're Sterling. Leonard Sterling. You taught my grandson Kevin at Northwood High. Best music teacher that school ever had." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone knew me. Someone saw me not as a burden or a client, but as the person I had been. "Arthur," the man said, sticking out a hand. "I beat the drums back there. Poorly, I might add." I shook his hand. "A pleasure, Arthur." "So what are you doing slumming it with us amateurs?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm retired," I said simply. "Needed something to do." Arthur grunted. "Well, you've come to the right place if you're looking for something to do. We've got a lot of heart, but not a lot of harmony. That first night, I barely played. I mostly listened. I saw a young girl, maybe 16, struggling with her cello. Her bow was skipping, and her posture was all wrong. During the next break, I couldn't help myself. Old habits die hard. I walked over to her. "Excuse me," I said gently. "I'm Leonard. Mind if I make a suggestion?" She looked up at me, her face flushed with frustration. "Please." I sound like a dying cat. I smiled. "We all do at first. Try sitting up straighter. Let your shoulders relax, and hold the bow like you're holding a small bird. Firm, but gentle." I adjusted her grip, showed her how to draw the bow smoothly across the strings. She tried again. The note that came out was still a bit shaky, but it was clear. It was a proper C. Her eyes went wide. "Whoa," she whispered. "That's it," I said. "Just like that." From that moment on, something shifted. My secret plan wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a plan for survival. And its blueprint was the thing I knew best, teaching. The next week, I arrived early and started sorting through the chaotic mess of the sheet music library. The scores were torn, disorganized, with missing parts. I spent an hour taping pages, organizing them by composer, creating a system. When the other members started to arrive, they found a neatly stacked library for the first time ever. Beatrice, the first chair violinist, a stern woman in her 60s with a perpetually worried expression, stared at the organized shelves. "Who did this?" she asked the room at large. Arthur pointed a drumstick at me. "Our new clarinetist. The man's a menace." I started doing little things. I showed the flute section a breathing exercise to help them sustain their notes. I helped Arthur tune his timpani, which he'd been whacking with blissful ignorance to the fact that they were tuned to two completely discordant notes. I wasn't trying to usurp Mr. Abernathy, but he was so overwhelmed that he seemed grateful for the help. The orchestra began to sound marginally better. Not good, but better. There was a flicker of potential, but the group was fragile. At the end of one rehearsal, Mr. Abernathy announced, with a defeated sigh, that the city was considering repurposing the community hall. Our funding was being reviewed. Unless we could demonstrate significant community engagement, we were likely to lose our space. The mood in the room deflated instantly. A few weeks later, the final blow came. Mr. Abernathy, after a particularly disastrous attempt at a Sousa march, laid down his baton, declared us all unteachable, and quit on the spot. Silence fell over the room, not the loud, oppressive silence of my apartment, but a sad, defeated silence. This was it. It was over. People started packing their instruments. The girl with the cello, whose name I'd learned was Maya, looked like she was about to cry. Then Arthur's voice boomed from the back of the room. "Hold on a minute," he shouted, banging a drumstick on his snare for emphasis. Everyone froze. He pointed that same stick at me. "We're not done. We've got a world-class music educator sitting right here in the second row pretending to be a clarinet player." All eyes turned to me. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. "Arthur," Beatrice stood up. "He's right. Leonard, in the few weeks you've been here, you've done more for us than Mr. Abernathy did in 2 years. You fixed the library. You helped Maya. You tuned the timpani. You know what you're doing." "Please, Mr. Sterling," Maya said, her voice small. "Don't let them shut us down." They all looked at me, this ragtag collection of dreamers and hobbyists. They weren't looking at a frail old man who needed to be managed. They were looking at a leader. They were looking at me with hope. In their eyes I saw not the reflection of a burden, but the reflection of a purpose. And that's when the whim for survival transformed into a plan. A real plan. My son had taken my home, my past, my connection to my own family. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he was wrong. He had left me with my savings, the nest egg I had carefully built over a lifetime of modest living, the money Daniel saw as his future inheritance, his emergency fund. I looked at the hopeful faces of the Oak Creek Community Orchestra. I thought of the screech of Maya's cello turning into a clear, beautiful note. I thought of Arthur's booming laugh. I thought of the glorious, life-affirming noise we could make together. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that moment, it was about choosing life. It was about choosing sound over silence. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in a year. "I'll do it. But if I'm going to be your conductor, we're going to do this properly." A ragged cheer went up in the room. I stood up and walked to the front, picking up the baton Mr. Abernathy had left behind. It felt light in my hand. It felt right. That night, back in my beige apartment, I didn't turn on the television. I sat down at the small kitchen table with a pen and a notebook. I opened my most recent bank statement, the one I'd been ignoring for months. The number was substantial. It was the sum total of a frugal life, of careful investments, of the liquidated assets of my former home. It was Daniel's safety net. I looked at the number, and for the first time, I didn't see it as the ghost of my past life with Helen, or as a future payout for my son. I saw it as ammunition. I saw it as a war chest. My son and his wife had pushed me into a quiet corner to be forgotten. They couldn't imagine I'd ever find a new voice, a new purpose. The plan forming in my mind wasn't just about saving an orchestra anymore. It was about building a fortress of sound and community and joy, funded by the very nest egg my son was counting on to bail out his next failure. He thought he controlled my future. He had no idea I was about to invest it. The first act as conductor of the Oak Creek Community Orchestra was not to raise a baton, but to open my wallet. I walked into the local music shop the next day, a place I had frequented for decades to buy supplies for my students. The owner, a man named George, who was almost as old as I was, greeted me with a warm smile. "Leonard, good to see you. What can I get for you?" "Some new reeds for that old clarinet." "Something better, George," I said, a feeling of resolve settling in my chest. "Give me 3 boxes of your best violin strings, a dozen high-quality reeds for every woodwind instrument we have, and all the valve oil and slide grease you've got in stock." George raised an eyebrow. "Starting your own school?" "Something like that," I said. "I'm conducting the community orchestra now." His face broke into a wide grin. "Well, I'll be. It's about time someone whipped that group into shape. It's on the house, Lenny, a welcome back gift." I shook my head. "No, George, this is an investment. Ring it up. From now on, this orchestra pays its own way." I paid in cash. It was a small amount, a few $100s from my savings, but it felt momentous. It was the first brick in my new foundation. That Tuesday evening, I arrived at rehearsal with 2 large bags. I didn't make a speech. I just walked around the room, handing out the new supplies. I gave the new strings to Beatrice and her violin section. I handed the crisp, new reeds to the clarinet and sax players. I gave the oil to the trumpet players. The effect was immediate. It was a tangible sign that things were different now. It was a message: you are worth investing in. "All right," I said, stepping onto the conductor's podium. It was just a rickety wooden box, but it felt like a stage. Forget Mozart for now. We're going back to basics. Page 1 of your beginner books. A concert B-flat scale. A collective groan went through the room. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice said, her tone skeptical, "we're past scales." "With all due respect, Beatrice, you're not," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "An orchestra is like a building. If the foundation is cracked, the whole thing will collapse. Our foundation is cracked. We're going to fix it. We are going to learn to listen to each other. We are going to learn to play as one. Now from the top, whole notes, and I want to hear every single one of you." For the next hour, we did nothing but play scales. I was relentless. I made them hold notes until their breath gave out. I walked through the sections, correcting posture, adjusting hand positions, and tuning instruments. I made the loud ones play softer and the timid ones play louder. It was tedious. It was frustrating. But slowly, miraculously, a change began to occur. The cacophony began to resolve into something resembling a unified sound. They were starting to listen. My plan was simple: build from the ground up. I spent my days rewriting music. I took complex classical pieces and arranged them specifically for our orchestra's strange instrumentation and varied skill levels. I wrote a simple, beautiful harmony for Maya's cello to anchor the string section. I wrote a powerful rhythmic bass line for the tubas and trombones to give the brass some confidence. I wrote a challenging but achievable percussion part for Arthur, who was beaming with pride. I was using my 40 years of experience not just to lead but to serve them, to make them sound better than they ever thought they could. My silent takeover was about creating value where there had been none. I started a Saturday morning junior program offering free lessons to kids in the community. My teachers, the more experienced members of the orchestra, Beatrice, initially hesitant, discovered she had a wonderful knack for teaching young violinists. Arthur became a grandfather figure to a group of rambunctious preteen drummers. We were no longer just a club for hobbyists. We were becoming a community institution. All this time there was only silence from my son. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. I didn't care. The silence in my apartment was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. It was filled with the echoes of the music from the night before, with the satisfaction of a hard day's work. My world, once shrunk to the size of a beige box, had expanded to encompass the lives of 50 different people. Then one evening, as I was in the middle of a rehearsal trying to get the French horns to come in on the right beat, my flip phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Annoyed, I called for a 5-minute break and stepped out into the hallway. It was an unknown number. I answered. "Dad?" The voice was strained tight with a stress I knew all too well. It was Daniel. "Hello, Daniel," I said, my voice even. "Where have you been?" "I've been trying to call you for an hour." The immediate accusation, the assumption that my time was his to command. Some things never changed. "I was busy," I said calmly. He must have heard the noise of the orchestra tuning up in the background. "What is that sound?" "It sounds like a riot." "Where are you?" "I'm at rehearsal," I said. "Rehearsal? For what?" He sounded genuinely baffled, as if I'd told him I was building a rocket ship. The concept of me having a life, a passion, was completely alien to him. The community orchestra. I'm the conductor now. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to process this useless piece of information. "The what?" "Dad, listen, I don't have time for this. I need your help. I've run into a bit of a cash flow problem with the new venture." A cash flow problem. The same euphemism he always used. It meant he was broke. It meant he had failed again. The old me, the man who lived by Helen's promise, would have felt a surge of pity and fear. My first question would have been, "How much do you need?" But I was not that man anymore. I was Maestro Sterling, a man with 50 musicians waiting for him. "I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel," I said, and the surprising thing was I meant it. I was sorry for him. I was sorry for the man he had become, a man whose only solution was to take from others. "But I'm in the middle of something important right now." "Important?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad, this is my livelihood we're talking about. It's serious. What could be more important than that?" I looked through the small window in the door to the rehearsal hall. I saw Maya showing a younger girl how to hold her bow, the exact same way I had shown her. I saw Arthur laughing with his drum students. I saw Beatrice patiently tuning a tiny quarter-sized violin. I smiled. "I'm with my family, Daniel," I said. "I have to go," and I hung up the phone. I walked back into the rehearsal hall, the buzz of Daniel's panic already fading, replaced by the warm, eager energy of the room. I stepped back onto my podium. The silence I commanded now was not one of loneliness, but one of anticipation. 50 faces looked up at me, waiting for the downbeat. I had taken their noise and was turning it into music. My son had demanded I listen to his chaos, but I had finally chosen my own symphony. The takeover wasn't silent anymore. It was starting to get very, very loud. The change was palpable, not just in the orchestra, but in my own life. The success of our junior program had created a buzz in the community. Suddenly, I wasn't the anonymous old man in apartment 3B anymore. In the hallway, neighbors who used to nod curtly would now stop me. "Mr. Sterling, my daughter loves the cello lessons. Thank you so much." The manager of the apartment building, a woman who had previously only spoken to me about maintenance requests, now greeted me as maestro. This was a reverse exodus. Instead of my family pushing me out, a new community was pulling me in. We planned our first public performance, a free concert in the park on a Sunday afternoon. We wanted to show the city and ourselves what we had become. The local newspaper, the Oak Creek Chronicle, even sent a young reporter who wrote a small but glowing piece about the retired music teacher who was breathing new life into a local treasure. The article included a picture of me, baton in hand, smiling. Actually smiling. I barely recognized the man in the photo. He looked happy. Meanwhile, the storm clouds were gathering over Daniel's world. His desperate countermoves began, as they always did, with an escalation of pressure. After I hung up on him, he and Karen must have gone into a full-blown panic. 2 days later, my apartment buzzer shrieked. It was them. They hadn't called. They had just shown up. A tactic designed to overwhelm and corner me. I buzzed them in, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. I was not afraid. I was curious. I opened the door, and they swept in, bringing with them a gust of cold air and expensive perfume. Karen immediately began her performance, her eyes wide with fake concern. "Leonard, oh thank goodness. We were so worried when you hung up on Daniel. We came as fast as we could." She looked around my small, tidy apartment, a place she had chosen for me, with an expression of profound pity. "Oh, this place is just so cozy. You must be terribly lonely here." Daniel cut right through the pretense. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping. "Dad, we need to talk. Seriously, I'm in real trouble here." I gestured to the 2 chairs opposite my own. "Sit down." They sat. Daniel launched into a long, convoluted story about a business partner who had betrayed him, about market fluctuations, about unforeseen expenses. It was the same script he had used for his failed startup, just with a few new characters and settings. The subtext was clear. None of this is my fault, and you are obligated to fix it. He finally got to the point. He needed money, a lot of it. He named a figure that made me inwardly whistle. It was a sum that would have gutted a significant portion of my life's savings. He wasn't asking for a loan. He was demanding a withdrawal. I let him finish. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. The old me would have been wringing my hands, already calculating how I could move the funds, how I could sacrifice my own security for his. But the new me just sat there, looking from my son's desperate face to his wife's expectant one. "I understand you're in a difficult position," I said, my voice level and devoid of the panic he was trying to induce. "It sounds very stressful." Daniel leaned forward, sensing an opening. "It is, Dad. It's a nightmare, but we can fix it. I just need you to call the trust manager and authorize a transfer." "Ah," I said, nodding slowly. "The trust. Yes, I've been meaning to look into that. Tell me, Daniel, after the sale of my house and the purchase of this apartment, and after your administrative fees, how much exactly is in that account?" He stammered for a moment. It's a healthy amount, Dad. Plenty to cover this and leave you more than enough." "I see," I said. The thing is, Daniel, my financial priorities have changed. Karen forced a laugh. Oh, Leonard, what does that even mean? Your priority is your family. Is it? I asked, looking her directly in the eye. Because for the first 2 months, I was in this apartment, the one you put me in. I didn't hear a word from my family. I didn't even have your phone number. My family, it seemed, had decided my priority was to be silent and out of the way. The color drained from their faces. It was the first time I had ever confronted them with the truth of their neglect. Daniel bristled. That's not fair. We were busy. We got you the phone for emergencies. And what constitutes an emergency, Daniel? I asked quietly. My profound loneliness, my despair, or just your need for money? It seems only one of those was urgent enough to warrant a call. I stood up and walked over to my small desk. I picked up a concert flyer. It had the newspaper article taped to it. I handed it to him. My priority now, I said, is the Oak Creek Community Orchestra. I am their conductor. We have 50 members. We have a junior program with 24 children. We have a concert in 2 weeks. These people depend on me. They see me. They value me. They are my priority. Daniel stared at the flyer as if it were written in a foreign language. The picture of me smiling seemed to enrage him. A hobby? He sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. You're throwing away your money on a band for old people, on strangers. That money is for your care. It's for the family. And there it was, the heart of the matter, the raw, ugly truth. No, Daniel, I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. It's my money, not our money, not the family's money, mine, to be spent on what I value. And I have discovered, much to my surprise, that I value the screech of a beginner's violin far more than I value funding your next failure. The bank of Dad is closed, permanently. The power shift in that room was a seismic event. The desperate pleading in their eyes curdled into pure, impotent rage. They had come here for a transaction, expecting a quiet, compliant teller. They had found a chairman of the board who was liquidating their account. They left not with quick, sterile hugs, but with slammed doors and shouted threats about lawyers and competency hearings. I just stood in the middle of my small living room, the silence they had built for me now a fortress of my own making, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly free. The threat of lawyers was Daniel's last-ditch effort, the desperate gambit of a man who has lost all other forms of leverage. I knew it was a bluff. A competency hearing would require evidence, and the only evidence available was that of a man who had taken a failing community group and turned it into a thriving local institution. The article in the Chronicle was my shield. Still, the threat was a final, ugly severing of a bond I had once cherished. With that door firmly closed, I turned all my energy and a significant portion of my resources toward the concert. The music we had chosen was ambitious, a medley of classic movie themes. It was challenging but crowd-pleasing. There was just one problem. To really make the finale, the main theme from Star Wars land with the power it needed, we needed a proper rhythm section. Our existing percussion was a mishmash of old-school band equipment. What we were missing, what we desperately needed for that thunderous, majestic sound, was a good set of timpani. I knew what they cost. I had been dreaming of a set for my high school orchestra for years, but it was never in the budget. Now the budget was mine. I went to my bank the next morning. It was the main branch downtown, the one where Helen and I had opened our first joint account. I sat down with a young manager and explained what I wanted to do. I was going to make a very large withdrawal from my savings account. He looked at the amount on the paper I slid across the desk, then back at me. That's a significant sum, Mr. Sterling. May I ask what it's for? We have investment vehicles that could offer a much better return. I smiled. I'm investing in joy, I told him. The returns are immediate. There were forms to sign, identity checks to pass. It was the kind of transaction that raised flags. At one point he asked me if I was under any pressure to make this withdrawal. I thought of Daniel's angry, desperate face. None at all, I said truthfully. This is entirely my own decision. The money was transferred. A few days later, 2 giant wooden crates were delivered to the community hall. Arthur and I pried them open with crowbars. Inside, nestled in a sea of packing foam, were 4 gleaming copper-bowled timpani drums. They were magnificent. They shone under the dim lights of the hall like treasure. Arthur, the gruff old percussionist, just stared at them, his mouth agape. He ran a calloused hand over the smooth, curved copper of the largest drum. He looked at me, his eyes wet with tears. "Lenny," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I dreamed of playing a set like this my whole life." "Well, fire away, Arthur," I said, grinning. "They're all yours." That night at rehearsal, when Arthur played his first roll on the new drums, the sound was earth-shattering. It was a deep, resonant thunder that filled the room and vibrated right through the floor into the soles of our feet. It was the sound of a dream being realized. It was the sound of my money being put to its best and highest use. In that moment, watching the stunned, joyful faces of my orchestra, I knew I had never made a better investment. The inevitable phone call came 2 days later. Daniel must have had alerts set up on the trust account, the one he thought he controlled. My withdrawal had set off every alarm bell. I was in the rehearsal hall listening to Maya play a short, beautiful solo I had written just for her when my flip phone rang. I saw the number. It was him. I let it ring. He called back immediately. I let it ring again. On the 3rd try, I walked out into the hall and answered. I didn't even have a chance to say hello. "What did you do?" he screamed into the phone, his voice distorted with fury. "What did you do with the money?" "I checked the account. It's gone. A huge chunk of it is gone." I held the phone a few inches from my ear, waiting for him to run out of breath. The contrast was almost poetic. On one side of the door, Maya was playing a soft lyrical melody. On the other, my son was spewing pure toxic rage. "I needed that money, Dad," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "That was for the business. That was for your grandchildren. How could you be so selfish?" Selfish. The word hung in the air. For 40 years I had done nothing but give. I had given my time, my energy, my love, and my money. I had sacrificed my own dreams so he could pursue his. I had kept my promise to his mother, even when it hurt, and my reward was to be called selfish by the most selfish man I had ever known. I stood there in the hallway of the library basement, the glorious sound of my orchestra swelling behind me. I looked back through the window at the new timpani, gleaming like 4 copper moons. I thought of Arthur's tear-filled eyes. I thought of Maya's confidence. I thought of the 50 people who had become my reason for getting up in the morning. I took a calm, deep breath. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a quiet, profound sense of peace. He couldn't touch me anymore. "I'm sorry, Daniel," I said, and my voice was steady and clear. "I can't help you." "What do you mean, you can't help me?" he demanded. "Where is the money?" I smiled, a real, genuine smile. The sound of Arthur's new drums rolled like triumphant thunder in the background. I told you my priorities have changed, I said. I just spent my savings on a new set of timpani drums for my family. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need to hear the sputtering, the threats, the final pathetic gasps of his entitlement. I pressed the red button, ending the call, and in doing so I ended the last toxic chapter of my old life. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of victory. I walked back into the music, my music, and I raised my baton. The day of the concert in the park was perfect. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the great oak trees that gave our town its name. By the time we were setting up on the old wooden bandstand, the lawn in front of us was already dotted with families on blankets and elderly couples in lawn chairs. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out. My orchestra was a nervous, excited jumble of energy. They were wearing our new uniforms, simple black shirts and pants which I'd bought for all of them. They looked like a real orchestra. They looked proud. I walked among them, offering a word of encouragement here, a confident nod there. Arthur was behind his magnificent new timpani, polishing the copper bowls for the 10th time. Maya gave me a shaky smile, clutching her cello. "I'm so nervous, Mr. Sterling," she whispered. "You'll be wonderful," I told her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Just play from the heart. That's all that matters." When I stepped onto the podium and raised my baton, a hush fell over the crowd. I looked out at the sea of faces, and then I looked at my orchestra, my family. I took a deep breath and gave the downbeat. We weren't the Boston Pops. We weren't perfect. A trumpet squeaked here. A violin was a little flat there. But we were full of heart. We played with a joy and a passion that was infectious. When we got to the medley, the crowd started to murmur with recognition. They cheered after the theme from Rocky. They hummed along to the sound of music. Then came the finale, the main theme from Star Wars. I looked at Arthur. He nodded, his eyes gleaming. I cued him, and the thunderous rolling introduction on the timpani filled the park. The brass came in, bold and triumphant. The strings soared. It was glorious. It was the sound of 50 people who had been told they weren't good enough, coming together to create something magnificent. When the final note faded, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the park erupted in applause. People were on their feet cheering and whistling. My orchestra members were beaming, some of them crying, all of them looking at me with a gratitude that filled my heart to bursting. I had them take a bow, and then another. They deserved every second of it. As I stood there, soaking in the sound of their success, I saw a movement at the very back of the crowd. It was a man and a woman standing half hidden behind a large oak tree. Daniel and Karen. They must have seen the flyers. They must have come to see my hobby for themselves. Daniel wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the crowd, at the cheering families, at the mayor who was walking towards the stage to shake my hand. He was looking at a world that I had built, a world that he had no part in, and his face was a mask of pure, bitter disbelief. He had tried to put me in a box, but I had built a kingdom instead. They turned and slipped away, disappearing into the shadows, and I knew I would likely never see them again. And I felt nothing but a quiet sense of pity for them. Now, as I sit here talking to you, my life is so different. The Oak Creek Community Orchestra has a permanent grant from the city. We have a waiting list for our junior program. My little beige apartment doesn't feel like a prison anymore. It feels like a sanctuary, a quiet place to rest and write music before I go out and rejoin the wonderful noise of my life. I learned something profound through all this. Family isn't always about blood. It's about respect. It's about who shows up when you're at your lowest. It's about who helps you tune your instrument when you can't find the right note. My son saw me as a bank account, an asset to be managed until it was depleted. My orchestra saw me as a teacher, a leader, a man with something left to give. They say silence is golden, but I'm here to tell you that's a lie told by people who want to keep you quiet. For me, the most valuable thing in the world is the glorious, imperfect, life-affirming sound of a beginner's violin, screeching its way toward a beautiful note. It's the sound of hope. It's the sound of a second act. My son thought my life was a quiet tragedy in its final pages. He just couldn't hear that it was only a brief rest before the overture to a brand new symphony. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever felt overlooked or had to fight to find your own music in the silence, please know you're not alone. If you enjoyed my story, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your strength. And I truly mean this. I would love to read about your own second acts in the comments below. Sharing our stories is how we build our own orchestra right here. Thank you again, and never let anyone silence your music.